Hello everyone, welcome back! So for this tutorial, I'll actually be doing some basic modeling. So if you're not at all caught up on how to model anything, you should probably check out the tutorials I've linked in the description. For Blender, I'd recommend the first 3 parts of the tutorial by Blender Guru. And for SketchUp, I have the first tutorial parts by Kaze and Manuar. If you check out the first 3 of those that are linked in the description, you should learn how to model for SketchUp a little bit. So anyways, on to the tutorial itself. So here I am in Blender, the modeling program I'm using, and I'm going to show you something about collision. So I'm not going to explain quite yet why I'm doing this, but first step I'm going to take is I'm going to just export this cube that I have present right here. So I'll just do it to SD4 junk, tutorial 4 stuff. I'll just export it as, let's say, cube.obj. Alright, so now I have one OBJ file and it's just this cube. That's one of the things I'll be loading into ROM Manager in a second, but to illustrate a point, I'm going to just briefly make another OBJ file. So if I go to edit mode, currently I'm in object mode, but if I go to edit mode in Blender, and don't worry, if you're using SketchUp, you can do the same thing via a different means, I'm pretty sure. Just, if you're using SketchUp, don't pay too much attention to how I'm doing this, just what I'm doing. But anyways, I'm going to select one of the sides of this cube, and I'm just going to kind of drag it out a bit. So now I have this rectangular prism shape, and I'm going to export this as an OBJ file as well. And yeah, technically it's a rectangular prism, but I'll just call it rectangle, just for simplicity. So if I export that, I now have 2 OBJ files, sorry. I have the cube as one, and I have this extended cube. It started off as the same exact way, but then I dragged one of the sides to make it larger on one side, and it's a larger cube in one dimension. So let me go into ROM Manager and show you why I've been doing all this wacky stuff. Alright, so here I am in ROM Manager, and if I just open my fresh ROM, then I can get started. So I'm going to go back to Level Manager, and I will choose, just once again, Bob-omb's Battlefield to overwrite. I could choose to overwrite Womps or anything else, but Bob-omb's is just very simple to do, so I'll just overwrite that. And I'll just add an area now. So the whole reason I was making these 2 different OBJ files is to show off the difference between these 2 things, the visual map and the collision map right here. And after that I'll explain why they're useful, but first things first. So if I just go to this visual map and click this load button to the right of it, if I load in my cube right here, you'll see that just automatically it loads for both this visual map field and this collision field. Both are relying upon my same file, this cube.obj. So the visual map, what is it? This is everything that the player sees when the level gets loaded in. So if I were to go to model preview, this reflects the fact that if I were to enter this level, I just see this cube right here. But that doesn't necessarily mean that I can actually stand on this cube. This is purely what you see in your level, this visual map. This collision thing, this collision field right here, that's what determines what you can actually stand on and what gets treated as a wall. So naturally, the cube.obj got loaded for both the visual map and the collision, because it's kind of expected that you'd want, if you had this cube in your level, to actually be able to stand on it. You want to be able to see it, but if you're seeing it, you should probably be able to stand on it as well. So if we go to the collision preview, you can see that currently, yes, this is what Mario can stand on in your level. And because it's the same file as the visual map right now, it's the exact same part of the level that you can stand on. But you remember before? I made that rectangle shape, which was the same as the cube but extended outwards in one of the directions. So if I load as my collision file instead this rectangle object file, you see now this thing will look like a cube, but it will have the collision of this rectangle object. So if I go to model preview, when I enter the level, it will still just look like this cube. But when I try to run around, I'll actually be running around on this whole wide rectangular prism. So in case that's a little confusing, let me show you in my emulator what this means. First, I just do have to actually load that in as my area 1, and I have to change where the warp is positioned so I don't just spawn in the middle of it and die as my level loads in. Alright, so now I can save and see you in the emulator. So here I am, right at the entrance to my level, and if I hop in and just select one of the acts, you'll see that I am just seeing a cube. I mentioned that what you see when you enter a level is the visual map, which in my case was just the cube. But what you're able to stand and run around on is purely a result of the collision map. So the reason that I'm standing on top of the cube right now is that the collision map I decided to use entirely overlaps the cube. But in addition to that, there's an area off to the side that is only in the collision map, but isn't in the visual map, so you can't see it, but I can stand on it. Let me see, is it this side? Nope. This side? Nope. Here it is. See? I can stand on this because, yeah, it was in the collision file. I can't see it because it wasn't in the visual file. So, I've done this purely as a demonstration to show you what these things are and why/how they're different, but I haven't explained yet why it's important. It's actually important for several reasons. The first thing is, you may want to, like, imagine in this corner, I put a pumpkin that I modeled. A pumpkin is really spherical, and that probably looks really nice, but if Mario were to jump around on it, Mario doesn't actually interact really well with cubes. He doesn't interact well with spheres, for instance, so if you were to jump on that, he might even just get stuck and your level would be in an incompletable state. So what you'd do is, you'd create your level with that sphere in the corner, and you'd export that to be using as the visual map, and then you'd take that same file, touch it up a bit, replace the sphere with like a cylinder, and then use that in the collision map. So that's one of the two reasons why this distinction is important. And the other is that sometimes there's just things that you want to have be there, but you don't want to see it. So let me show you why that might be the case. Alright, so I just quickly created this model that's just cute, two cubes right next to each other. So if I were to load this in as a level, you might think that nothing is wrong at all. But there's actually some huge thing that's wrong, and let me show you why that is. First, I'll just export it and name it 2 cubes, and then I'll show you importing it and playing it. There we go. Oh, and I just want to put it in test. Right here. Alright, see you there. Oh, and I forgot to mention it, but if you export a file, you have your OBJ file, but you can't go back and edit this model, so you should save this too. In SketchUp, I think it's a SketchUp file. In Blender, it's going to be saved as a .blend file. But yeah, I'll just name it cubes, I guess. Alright, on with the rest. Alright, so here I am in my ROM. And just to avoid any sort of confusion, I'm going to just start off basically entirely fresh. I'll remove that level that I was replacing. So what I just did was make it so that there's basically nothing in this ROM right now. No level that's been replaced. So I'll choose to, once again, just overwrite Bob-omb's Battlefield. You don't have to worry about what this is saying. And now I'm going to freshly add in, as an area, those 2 cubes and show you what the problem is. First I should just convert the model and then bring the spawn point up, because I want to make sure I just don't spawn inside of my model and die. Okay, see you there. Alright, so here I am. And I'll just hop into my level and show you a very interesting problem. So I'm standing on top of the first cube, but if I want to jump to the second one... Huh, you see that? Bonk. It's like I'm hitting some invisible wall right there. No matter how hard I try, there's just no way of getting past it. So let me explain in ROM Manager why this is happening. Alright, so here I am, and I will just select the editor button and show you what is going on. Oops. Just getting a better view is all I'm doing right now. Okay. So here we go. This is the cube I start on, and this is the cube I'm trying to jump to. So as I'm doing this whole process, I start off above this cube, and I try to jump over here, but there's actually nothing below me. You see, Mario 64 has this interesting quirk where Mario must always be above something. It doesn't matter whether he's a single foot above something, standing on something, 100 feet above, but he has to be above something. As long as I'm roaming around here, I'm on top of this cube. But as soon as I try to jump over this gap, no matter how far you look down, there is nothing below there. And the thing about the quirk that I was mentioning is that the game won't allow you even for an instant to be in that state of nothing being below you. If you would go somewhere where nothing is below you, the game just decides, no, I'm not going to let you even start going through this region. So it's like you hit an invisible wall, because if you were to continue any further, there'd be nothing below you. So we can actually solve part of this problem using that collision map, because yeah, we could just put a big rectangle underneath there, but it would look really ugly, wouldn't it? But what we can do is we can have these 2 cubes be as our visual map, but for our collision map, we could have the same exact structure of these 2 cubes, so that what we see and what we stand on is the same, but we can also add to that collision file that big rectangle underneath, so that there is a rectangle there, but we don't see it. So let me show you doing that. Alright, so this is my most recent file. If I click it, it will load this model that I had here. So if you remember, I already exported something that looks exactly like this, and I called it 2cubes.obj, I think. So I can just use that as my visual map, and then I can use what I have right now with a rectangle underneath it, and I can use that as my collision map. Since I'm starting from this point, I'm basically starting from what my visual map is. I don't have to worry about the 2 things not lining up. Like if I were to shift this over, my older file, it has a cube here and a cube here, but now this is misaligned in my collision file, so everything will get all wacky. But since let me just undo that change I made. Since I directly loaded the same thing I used for my visual map, everything will line up very nicely. So I'll just add that rectangle underneath and do nothing else to mess around with this. So if I go to this Create tab in Blender, you'd do this a different way in SketchUp, but yeah, I'm just adding a rectangle. So I add a rectangle, it gets put in some weird place, just wherever my cursor was. Don't worry too much about that right now. But I want to drag that to be underneath this area, because I can make that jump so long as there's something underneath this gap. So I want to put this kind of underneath the gap, but it's hard to see where I am really. So I'll hit 7 on the number pad, and that gives me a top-down view, which lets me align this really easily. Just a quick note, what if you don't have a number key? A number pad? You can just quickly go to File, User Preferences, Input, and Emulate Numpad. Then if you just save your user settings, you can just hit 7 on your keyboard, and it will do the same thing. So anyways, I have this top-down view. I'll maneuver this rectangle to be about where I want it centered to be. And then I can hit S. S lets you just make something larger or smaller without changing anything about it. Without changing anything else about it, sorry. So if I hit just S and move the mouse a bit, and then click, there we go. I have the cube with this rectangle underneath it. So if I were to jump out to the left, I'd have something underneath me. If I were to jump from this cube to this cube, for every step of the way, I'd have something underneath me. This big rectangle here. So I don't want that to appear in my level visually. I don't want to look down and see this ugly gray thing. So I'm just going to export this as an OBJ and use this purely as my visual map. So if I just go to File, Export, once again as an OBJ, right here. If I name this cubes with rect, I guess, and I export that, I can show you why I just did this in ROM Manager now. Alright, so here I am back in ROM Manager. If I were to go to the editor right now, I'd see that I still have exactly where I left things off last time I was in ROM Manager, where I have these 2 cubes, and just that's it. And I moved the spawn point right here. So I am fine with this being how my level looks, but I want my level to include that rectangle I just made underneath. So what I can actually do is, instead of having to delete this level and start all the way from scratch, I can just go to this area model thing. And if I hit this import model thing, I can, as my visual map, use what I was using before. This, I believe it was the 2 cubes OBJ file. So that's what I was using before. But now for the collision, I'm going to change it to be something different. I'm going to change it to be those cubes with that rectangle underneath it, which is what I named cubes with rect.obj. So if I select that, you can actually preview what I just did. If you go to model preview, you'll see that there's only these 2 cubes visible, and that's because I used for the visual map 2 cubes.obj. But if I go to collision preview, you'll see that I have these 2 cubes, but there's this plane underneath that I can stand on. So since there's something underneath, I can make this jump because, yeah, there's something underneath Mario at all times. But I don't have to actually visually see it because it's only in the collision file. So let me go to let me go to my emulator and show you that in action. Oh, but first I just have to load it in as my new Area 1. Oh, and you'll see if I go to my editor that any object I moved before will still be moved. I didn't delete the area, I just imported a new level model. So all the work I took in placing my objects before will still be there. Anyways, see you in the emulator. Let's go. So as I load in, you'll see that once again there's 2 cubes, but this time I can actually jump from one to the other. And that's because, yeah, there's something underneath me at every point. Even when I'm crossing this gap and there's neither of these cubes underneath me, there's that rectangle underneath me, so I'm all set. And I'm able to run around on these cubes exactly as I see them because, if you remember, I used almost the same exact file for both my visual map and the collision map. The only difference was that rectangle. So because I started messing around in my collision file from the same file that had these two cubes in it, I'm able to run around these cubes exactly as they look. So anyways, there still is a problem present even though I can jump from one to the other. And that's that if I miss this jump, I'm stuck down here on some random plane that doesn't have anything to do on it. If I had all my stars and pink bob-ombs to talk to, enemies, just all sorts of things to do in my level itself way up there, well, it sure as heck isn't down here. So, ideally what would happen is that if we ever fell down here, Mario would just die and get booted out of the level. That way we wouldn't have to worry about him hanging down here where there's nothing to do, and yet we could still punish the player a bit for missing a jump. So, that's done by making this plane that I'm standing on a death plane. But before that, I have to explain a little bit about textures.